You may have noticed some chip out when cutting hardwoods and plywoods on your table saw, and the reason is the throat plate that came with your machine. That throat plate is built to allow the table saw blade to tilt at 45, but when it's standing at 90 degrees, there's a huge space between the edge of the blade and that throat plate. This large gap does not support the workpiece, and the result is tear out. Let me show you how you can replace this throat plate with a zero clearance insert that tightens this gap to all but zero. That way the cut is well supported and you will get no tear out when cutting plywoods and hardwoods. Now let me show you how to make these. I like to make multiples. That way I have one for each tilt of the blade, for various thicknesses of blade, even dado sets, and I'll show you how to do that easily on a router table and a pattern bit. If you don't have a router table and a pattern bit, we'll show you an easy way to do that on a bandsaw and a sander. So here's the material I'm going to use. This is 1/2 inch multi-ply plywood. I use 1/2 inch because it's about the same thickness as the existing throat plate, and I like to use plywood because it's a lot more stable than hardwood. To get it to the width I need, I'm actually going to use the existing throat plate as a gauge. So I'll slide the fence over until that throat plate just touches the saw blade tooth, and now I can rip this to the correct width. Okay, now let's take our existing throat plate out and apply a little double stick tape to the face of this. And affix that to the plywood. Now that I've affixed this to the plywood, and of course I want to make sure that the throat plate is even with the plywood on both sides, and I've noticed on one side my plywood's just a hair proud, but that's okay, we'll take care of that with the router bit. I'm going to take this to the bandsaw and remove the excess material on either end. When I start the cut here, I just want to make sure that I'm going to stay between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch away. I want to be nice and close, but of course I don't want to nick the throat plate at all. Now to remove the rough edges caused by the bandsaw, I'm going to use what's called a pattern bit in a router table. And this is it. You can see the cutting edge on the outside end lines up perfectly with that bearing. And in this case, the pattern is our old throat plate attached to the piece of plywood. And what I've done is raised that bit so that the bearing itself bears directly on that old throat plate. Whatever overhangs the outside, the plywood, is going to be removed by those blades. All right, let's see how the plate comes off. Not too bad, sometimes they never come off. And let's see how this fits. And the fit is perfect, except for the height. One of the things you'll notice is, at least on a 10-inch table saw like this one, the blade, a 10-inch blade, sits just a little higher than the 1/2 inch that I need as a recess. So one of the options, at least the one I would suggest that you do, is remove your 10-inch blade and put a dado blade on there. Usually those are only 6 or 8 inch. That smaller diameter will allow you to fit the plate on there nicely, and then we'll show you how to cut this to make a true zero clearance. Okay, I've installed a blade. Now this is one blade of my dado set, in this case an 8-inch diameter blade. So you'll notice it goes right down well below the tabletop. Put our new insert in, slide our fence over, And what I'm going to do is position the fence, of course, out of the way of the blade, and lock it. This will allow me now to raise the blade while it's running and cut the kerf in the center of that board. Now, as an alternative to using your router table and pattern bit as you've just seen, there is another method of making these using just your bandsaw and a sander. What we'll do is do the same cut to width as we did on the table saw. Now take your throat plate, set it on your blank, and using a pencil just trace those two radiused edges. Now I'll go to the bandsaw, cut those, leaving a little bit of space between the pencil line and your cut. And we're going to take that then to a disc sander and clean up those edges. Now that you've inserted your new zero clearance insert, you may find that it does not sit flush with the surface of the table. You may have to shim this much like they did with the existing throat plate. I just took the same 4 screws out of my existing throat plate and I drilled a 7/32 inch hole to match the same pattern as the throat plate, and literally used these screws to screw down through that plate and allow some adjustment. Also took and bored a 3/4 inch hole through the throat plate itself. That makes it easier to get in on the table. You're going to use your new zero clearance insert quite a bit. In fact, probably to a point where you're not going to use your old throat plate at all. If you want any additional tips and techniques on the table saw, please see us at woodmagazine.com.